Uh, as Amanda mentioned, I'm Karl VanDevender. I'm a professor in biological agricultural engineering. To be honest with you, I prefer to think of myself as an extension engineer first and a professor second. I've been working as 100% extension since 1992, in December of 92, working in the area of livestock manure management and the associated areas around it: water quality regulations, phosphorus management, nutrient management. And my experience has been more with the management of manure and the application of manures in a where the manures are stored, then ultimately land applied to either pasture or hay ground. So the effective, my experience applying to a produce is very limited frankly, mainly the academic. In fact, I was the one that asked the question about defined produce. So the question you may be asking is, well, what does VanDevender's experience have to do with the application of manures to produce? And really the application is Arkansas has got a lot of manure application regulations that pertain to the application of manure and animal byproducts and other nutrients, uh, just from the environmental protective component of it. So you may find yourself under a situation where you're applying an animal derived nutrient source for the purpose of producing produce. So you're subject to those kind of regulations, but at the same time, you're making an application, so you're also subject to the environmentally concerned regulations. So what I'm going to do today is really kind of fall back and discuss what is on-farm nutrient management and follow in with that with what are the potential regulations. The first thing I'd like to start off with is I am a very firm believer in nutrient management, planning and the planning process. I consider it just like the chainsaw you see right there in front of you. It's a very useful tool, but if you ain't careful, you can cut your leg off with the stupid thing. So you need to be careful with its use.
Karl, real quick before you go on.
Sure, thank you.
If you could just make sure that you're sharing screen. We cannot see slides if you're showing them.
I was bragging about turning off the mute, and then I got hammered by not sharing my screen. That's what ego and pride will do for you, ain't it?
There you go, Karl. You got it.
Thank you, Amanda. It's always nice to be called to the fault because that keeps you on the ground.
Hey, we always need a little help from our friends.
Yeah, exactly. But as you can see from the slide now, I've got a chainsaw there in the picture. And like I said, I'm a firm believer in the nutrient management planning process. I think there's a lot of value to it from a farm resource management perspective. At the same time, the regulatory community and the community with a focus over on environmental protection has a view of the nutrient management planning as a good tool to include in the regulation. So it's a little bit of both. Excuse me. I got to activate my stuff here. Okay, with nutrient management planning, we really need to be asking ourselves the question, what is it? Who should get a plan? Why should they get a plan? And I am a firm believer whenever you're fixing to get in and start doing something, you need to be asking yourself, what are the potential gotchas that you're going to get into that may cause things to turn out less than what you'd like them to turn out to be? So just kind of thinking ahead and looking for places that might get you. Now, a thought that occurred to me while I was thinking about this meeting, and the fact that while I'm normally familiar and comfortable talking about livestock manure applications and the application of manure and mortality compost to pasture ground. One thing that I really had never really thought about much is when we start talking about nutrient application, you're talking about, okay, where are these nutrients being sourced from? And, typically I have thought in terms of, okay, animal manures has got N, P, and K, just like you get in the commercial fertilizers. But it's also got odorous compounds, which a lot of folks complain about. It's got significant moisture, maybe as low as 25% for a very dry broiler litter. Straight out of the back end of a cow as excreted, it's probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 90%. You start adding water to it as you get from a hog barn or something like that, it may go up to 99 to 98 to 99%. It's going to have a lot of microorganisms in it. Some of them would be classified as non-harmful. Others you really want to be careful about and how you're handling those and where you put them. With inorganic fertilizers, we tend to think of those as NPK only, but the truth is they've got inert filler material so that you have enough volume that you can actually manage the application and control the uniformity of that application. And one thing that caught my attention years ago was a study that compared the application of chicken litter and swine manure to grass and taking a look at the pathogens, E. coli concentrations in the application area after the application. And they were comparing the swine and the poultry areas, application areas, to the application area where they put commercial fertilizer and where nothing was applied. And they also did some rainfall runoff simulators in the process. And they found even the application of NP and K resulted in a slight increase in pathogens, not what you got with the animal manures, but an increase. And I scratched my head and said, why would that be the case? Then I realized, hey, NP and K is food. It's food for your crop. It's going to be food for your microorganisms as well. So that may be the bump. The other thing that we need to remember is both the inorganic and the organic nutrient sources are going to have micronutrients to some degree, depending on what you're applying. And they're going to have the ability, or some of them will have a greater ability to shift the pH, which may be beneficial or it may be harmful, depending on where the pH is to start with before the application and where you would like it to be after the application. So with nutrient management planning, what are we really trying to do? We're trying to use the nutrients wisely for optimum economic benefits. We're trying to maintain or improve the condition of the soil. We want to minimize the impact on the environment. And, quite often, as I indicated earlier, where there are required nutrient plans are required by law or permit. And if they're required by permit, you would like to do it in such a way that you get legal protection that comes with compliance and documentation of that compliance. Now, there are a lot of different flavors of nutrient management plans. It's gotten to the point that nutrient management plans is kind of like the word Band-Aid. It has a general idea and it's a valid idea, but you really have a lot of variability in what qualifies as a Band-Aid or a nutrient management plan. For example, on the screen, what you see in front of you is the NRCS definition of a comprehensive nutrient management plan that includes not only the base nutrient management plan, but it also includes the components that deal with your manure storage structures, your erosion controls on your application areas, your mortality disposal method on the farm, and potentially other components if the farmer's doing it, such as your feed additives. Other variants on a nutrient management plan with the Arkansas Natural Resources, that's the old name, with the Arkansas Department of Agriculture, the Natural Resources Group, under the nutrient surplus area regulations, they have poultry litter management plans. If you go to ADQ, you'll have what they call as a waste management plan. And just as we're going to see today, and we've already kind of started talking about, is there's going to be other concerns such as environmental concerns and potentially human health concerns that come up. Now, what a nutrient management plan is attempting to do is balance farm resources. In an ideal, perfect world, you'd have the balance of inputs of your investments, your labor, your fertilizer, your feed, would balance out perfectly with your outputs of profits, crop, and meat, and produce. The reality is nothing's perfect. We're dealing with a biological systems, and therefore you're going to end up with byproducts. Maybe the byproduct is excess nutrients, where you're applying poultry litter for its nitrogen value and you put out more phosphorus than your crop needs. Maybe it's environmental losses, ammonia losses to the atmosphere, phosphorus losses to receiving water. It may be that you've got crop byproducts where you put your material out and you're focused on raising chickens, and the hay you grow is not really what you want, but you really need to be hauling hay off the farm, so you exporting nutrients so that you have a place to apply more nutrients as they come on. And of course, the manure will potentially be a byproduct. So in the nutrient management planning process, ideally, it is an iterative process where you start off and say, hey, I want a nutrient management plan. So the planner goes to the farm. You get from the farm the initial farm conditions, what's going on now, what's going on in the past, what management practices are taking place, how many fields do you have, what are the descriptors for that field in terms of acres and cover crops or grass and nutrient levels in the field already. What are the future plans for that farmer? He's right here now, but where does he want to be in the future? Then the planner takes all this information and he goes back to the office and he starts working with that information to develop a draft nutrient management plan using those inputs and using the state's phosphorus index, which is a tool to try to address the risk for phosphorus runoff. And we'll get that in more details in a few minutes. And he develops this draft plan. So he takes this draft plan, goes back to the farmer and says, okay, here's what I've got based on all the inputs. This is what I'm suggesting that you do on how you balance out your resource needs and demands. And the farmer has to take a look at that and say, yeah, that looks pretty good. I'm willing to try to work on that for 5 years until we repeat the process. Or he says, no, I can't handle that. I got to do something different than that. That's not going to work for me. And if it's no, you go back and you make your revisions, you revise the plan, you change your management practice concepts. Some things you may be able to change in terms of farm conditions. You're not going to be able to change ground slopes, but maybe you can change the type of grass you're applying to. Or instead of using your grass as pasture, you change it over to hayfield. So you make those changes. Then you go back through the plan writing process till you get to the point that the farmer says, yes, I can handle that. Now, I actually have a misnomer on this chart. I've got done at the bottom. With nutrient management plan, you're never really done. What you're doing is you go through a periodic revision. So it's kind of an endless loop until the farmer retires and somebody else picks up the land management. So with nutrient management planning process, the initial idea is you go in, you determine, well, how much nutrients are available. And typically with animal manures, that's going to be, well, how much do you have? What's the volume of the material that you have? And what is the concentration of nutrients within that volume? If you're going to have in there a commercial fertilizer use as well, you might want to have some consideration. Well, how much commercial fertilizer can I buy and what can I buy at the local co-op? The next step is to determine your crop needs. And well, that's going to be, you just go out and you figure out which fields you're going to make applications to potentially, what kind of crop it is, how much nutrients it needs based on soil testing and the fertility recommendations from the university based on research. And that will tell you how much you need for each field on a per acre basis, as well as the total per field. Then you add all that up for the whole farm. And then the next step is, okay, I know how much nutrients I have. I know where I need it. And now I need to allocate these nutrients out. And again, this is not a perfect world. This is the real world. So in the balancing process, you need to be considering what are the agronomic concerns out there. I want to apply enough nutrients to get the crop to grow, but I don't want to throw away money. That brings in the economic concerns, practical concerns. Hey, this corner of the field down here on the South 40, I really can't get to it in this time of year because it's going to tend to be pretty wet. I just don't want to get in there and rut up the field or get my equipment stuck. On the other hand, if you're a liquid manure producer, you need to be able to make winter applications just to make sure that your ponds, you don't overtop your ponds and stuff. So you need some high ground that is what you can get into all the time during the entire year. And of course, there's also the legal concerns of you want to be legal and you want to obey the laws in your applications. And I forgot to mention the environmental concerns. One thing I'd like to stress, and I think everybody here is already going to agree with me, is some segments of our society kind of think of farmers and those who produce agricultural crops don't care about the environment. I would counter that by saying they probably care more or realistically for the environment, because the environment is what helps to determine their productivity, and it's the land that they own for their own use and for the use of their descendants. Anyway, when you get through with determining the available nutrients, determining your crop needs, determining how you're going to allocate out those nutrients, you have to make the decision of, well, how much nutrients do I need to import and how much do I need to export, and where those nutrients are going to come from or where are they going to go. One thing I'd like to stress, if you probably hadn't already figured it out, on the allocation process, it really is a juggling act where you're trying to juggle the regulatory, production, agronomic, economics, and science, not to mention personal preferences, in determining what's going to be a workable, feasible nutrient management plan. Because if it's not workable and it's not feasible, it ain't any good. You know, paperwork's not any good until you can actually implement it. I developed this graphic a number of years ago, and I like the idea of jigsaw puzzle pieces. And if you look at that carefully, you realize there is no way you're going to get all those puzzle pieces put together without bending some tabs. There's going to be compromises in the planning process. That's reality. The challenge is on those compromises, they have to be acceptable compromises to the process. Earlier, I mentioned the idea of a phosphorus index involved in the nutrient management plans. And in Arkansas, we use the phosphorus index in the nutrient management planning process, that the plan is used to develop and plan the applications of organic materials. Typically, we think in terms of animal manures, poultry litter, swine manure, dairy manure, but also the phosphorus index calculations are being expanded into the application of poultry processing materials that comes out of poultry processing plant. I've seen plans that were developed to address the application of water from a vegetable canning operation. And that was the case that the plant nutrient management plans were being developed, but really the primary concern was the application of salts. So, you know, The index is involved in a lot of different calculations. They're involving organic nutrients. And the idea with the nutrient management index is if you're applying an inorganic fertilizer, where you're trying to apply nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, conceptually, you can order the correct blend or develop the correct blend of inorganic fertilizers that you apply NP and K at the same rate that the crop needs NP and K. However, when you're working with an animal manure or other organic-based nutrient source, that's a prefixed package. Ain't nothing you can do with it except lose nitrogen typically. It's kind of like going to the farm supply store and say, I want a bag of triple 13. Well, you get 13% nitrogen, 13% P2O5, 13% K2O, and there's not much you can do about it. You just have to work with that particular blend. So with the regulatory concepts is typically when you're applying an inorganic fertilizer, you can apply the correct blend of nutrients so that you apply them at a rate that you're meeting the nutrient needs of the crop and you're not exceeding the nutrient needs of the crop. Well, with animal manures, that's not typically the case. Typically what you end up doing is there's a tendency to want to meet the nitrogen needs with your animal manure, which means you are almost always oversupplying the phosphorus needs. So what the index does is it says, okay, given all of these risk factors, what we're trying to do is balance out the need to meet the fertilizer needs of the crop without exceeding too much without exceeding too much the acceptable risk of phosphorus runoff. Now, to go into what the phosphorus index for pastures is in Arkansas, it was developed by a team, and Arkansas has its version. Every state has their version. USDA Agricultural Resource, Natural Resource Conservation Service, the University of Arkansas Division of Ag, and the Arkansas Natural Resources Commission and others were involved in the development of the index. And as you can see from the graphic there, it is kind of a jigsaw piece process where we've got various components working together. The index is based on runoff plot research. In fact, that's the research I talked about earlier, where chicken litter and poultry swine manure was applied on runoff plots with commercial fertilizers. There were also municipal sludges were applied, both liquid and dry, in that research process. So plot research work went into it. Erosion calculations went into it for the revised universal soil loss equation. Soil characteristics from NRCS goes into it. The historical runoff considerations were in there because the index takes a look at not only what is applied to the soil, but also what's the potential for runoff. And you really have to get a grasp on what's the antecedent moisture conditions and what's the likelihood of runoff to take place. And just because this is a case of we don't know nearly as much as we would have liked to know that in the process, there was professional judgment that involved in the development of the index. Sources of information to calculate the index, the erosion calculation, soil runoff information, flooding frequency, application methods, application timing, pasture management. Obviously, there's a lot of information. A lot of it is very site specific, right down to the field that you're working with. Now, on a calculational process, or what's the theory behind the index? Phosphorus loss is really from the edge of the field is affected by how much phosphorus was applied and what factors go into limiting the amount of runoff or increasing the amount of runoff within the application area, and what are additional conservation practices take place downslope of the application area, but before you hit the receiving waters. As an engineer, I like to say that the phosphorus loss risk is a function of its source potential, its transport potential, and additional BMPs. If you want to put it into a mathematical formula, it actually breaks out as the index is source potential times transport potential times the BMP's multiplier, then normalized by dividing by 1.8 and multiplied by 100. Now, ignore the math at this point. What are we trying to do with the index? What we're trying to do is evaluate or estimate the risk of phosphorus runoff. The greater the resulting value, the greater the risk is. We're trying to establish risk ranges. As you can see from the right, the ranges are low of less than 33, medium is 33 to 66, high is 67 to 100, and very high is greater than 100. So we've got ranges. So if the value falls in that range, you have some interpretive things that help you make management decisions. What I really, really like about the phosphorus indexing process is it provides a mechanism to really analyze what's going on, take a good estimate of what the environmental risks are, and then puts the landowner as much as possible in the driver's seat about determining, well, okay, this is the concern, this is the level of concern. What can I do in the management of my farm that will work for me to address these concerns while still addressing my environmental and economic and production concerns? Now, the risk ranges in the low range, it's really to just do what you're continuing to do, but be aware that if you're putting out more phosphorus than what the crop needs, you're going to build up soil test phosphorus. Medium range, your soil test phosphorus levels are getting a little bit higher, and long term you're going to find yourself in a bind because you're putting out more phosphorus than what the crop needs. So you may want to consider adding BMPs, or more likely try to figure out how to cut back on your application rates. The high range is technically you can make an application in that range, but you really need to be putting practices in place so you're effectively in the medium range. Realistically, what that means most of the time is a situation that ends up with a high number, the application rate is dropped to the point that you're in the medium range. And in the very high range, you're out of business. No more phosphorus gets applied to this block of ground until that phosphorus level comes back down again, usually through some kind of phosphorus mining process where you grow crops that pull the phosphorus out. And I'll go into a little more. All right. So I talked about the nutrient management planning process being an iterative process. Well, calculating the phosphorus index itself is an iterative process where you take the farm conditions, the management practices, you calculate the phosphorus source, you calculate the phosphorus transport potential, then you calculate the index value itself and normalize it. And then the question is that an acceptable value? Well, when you say acceptable value, you have to ask the question, acceptable to who? The state has those values there that basically says, if you're higher than 66, you need to be doing something to make it acceptable. But I've worked with landowners that said, well, the state may be happy with 66, but I want to be able to apply to my land for a number of years. So I want to develop a plan where my application phosphorus index value is not 66, but 40. So work on how he managed and what conditions would give him that risk range. So just like in the previous one, if it's not acceptable, you need to go back and repeat the process. If it is acceptable, you move to the next field. And when you get all the fields done in an acceptable way, then you go back to your nutrient management planning process. And then you start your aggregation process that I talked earlier, where you start thinking about, okay, this is how much applied to each field per acre. This is what the total is for each field. This is what the total is for the farm. Am I got too many nutrients in my material? Do I need to sell some, or do I have not enough nutrients and I need to import some? And ideally, you'd be thinking in terms of not only phosphorus, but nitrogen and potassium. And I'll talk about that more tomorrow. So what we need to be asking ourselves at this point is, if we've got regulations involved and we're trying to allocate resources, we need to be thinking in terms of, well, what do I need to do to have a successful nutrient management plan? The first thing is you need information, records, maps, databases from the farm. You need, your management in the past, what you'd like to manage in the future. You need your production information, both past and where you'd like to. You need the experience of the farmer. Nobody knows that block of ground better than the guy who's farming that block of ground. And without that experiential knowledge, you're going to be very hard pressed to develop a successful plan. And also, you need to be working with the farmer in meeting his preferences on how he wants to manage it. Because something that's developed that you don't like, you're not going to manage it very well. If you do like it and you do want to do that, your chances of successful managers are higher. You need to consider your soils and environmental considerations. What are the nutrient contents in your, both in the litter and the soils? What environmental considerations are in place? What are the legal issues? And when I developed this presentation, I inserted other, because you may have other factors that are associated with the fact that you're trying to produce a produce, and you need to meet the regulations associated with produce production with an animal-based nutrients. And finally, you've got the general production issues. There are some additional requirements for a successful nutrient management plan. You've probably gathered by now that it can get pretty hairy, moving beyond the theory of what a nutrient management plan is into the practical application and decision-making process of how to develop a plan. I am a firm believer that a successful plan is a team approach type of situation, where you've got the decision maker is the landowner ultimately. It's just like a doctor and a patient. The patient is responsible for his or her health. The doctor is the professional who's hired to help provide information on how the patient can manage their health. The same with a landowner and a plan writer. The plan writer may be an NRCS employee, it may be a conservation district employee, it may be consultants, and there will be additional expertise that will be needed from time to time. It may be your county agent, it may be others, especially for those who are working with the legal concerns and potentially with the application of materials to the produce. Continuing on with the requirements for a successful nutrient management plan. Up until this point, everything has been the development of a plan. And I've seen these plans go to 3 inches thick with information. The impressive documents, complicated documents at times, but really have done no value and has no value until you get successful implementation and you achieve the results that you're after. So you have an implementation, you've got your record keeping process, and just like I indicated earlier, you're never really done with a nutrient management plan. You've got a life cycle there, and you're always looking to take the most current knowledge, the most current research, the most current data for that particular farm, and develop a better plan as you move forward. Now, some key nutrient management concepts. Soil test phosphorus and the applied phosphorus, that's not the issue. Really, it's phosphorus in the runoff water that's the environmental risk. The phosphorus that's in your organic materials, exact same phosphorus that's in your inorganic sources. So the nutrients are the same, but the carriers will be different. I'll be the first to admit that while animal manures are a great fertilizer source, they tend to smell more than inorganic fertilizers. And inorganic fertilizers are a lot more uniform and they're easier to handle. If you reduce your litter application rates to reduce your nitrogen, because of your phosphorus concerns, you're probably not going to meet your nitrogen needs, which means you're going to have to come up with nitrogen from somewhere else or accept the fact that your crop production is going to go down eventually. Reducing soil test phosphorus, once it's built up, the only real effective way to get it down is through a phosphorus mining, which is growing crops that extract phosphorus, which typically means you're either going to have to apply commercial fertilizer or you're going to have to start growing legume-based crops. And I kind of hit at that. One thing I would like to stress, and I've tried to stress this more and more over time, is when we are working with a phosphorus index and the nutrient management planning process, what we really need to realize is if we're putting more phosphorus on the ground than what we're hauling off with our crop, our soil test phosphorus levels are going to go up. Which, the good news is if the soil test phosphorus levels are going up, that means it's not really hitting the creek as much as we may be concerned about. But the bad news is eventually we're going to be told you can't put any more phosphorus on. So what that means is when we're working with the nutrient management planning process and the phosphorus process, we need to be thinking about the application life of our fields. From an engineering design perspective, the farm is really a series of interlocking systems. And every time you make a decision on one system, there's going to be consequences within that system and very likely consequences with an associated system. Just like a classic example of livestock is you change the feed ration, you're going to change the concentration of the nutrients in the animal manure. The goals with nutrient management planning process, it's quite often a situation you can't get from point A to point B without going through multiple steps and possibly over multiple years. You're going to need partners quite often in developing a plan. We need to be willing to think outside the box. We need to be taking action, but we need to avoid being rashly. I like to think in terms of we got to think outside the box and be willing to climb outside the box, but you need to hang on tight because you might have to jump back in. And again, the critical concept is we need to think in terms of the application life of our fields. And a quote from Albert Einstein was, the problems we have created cannot be solved at the level of thinking that created them. All right, so who's requiring nutrient management plans? Or really the other way to ask it is, okay, what regulations am I going to be subject to? The answer is almost everybody's requiring plans these days, from regulations to the integrators to lending organizations. I've seen lawsuit situations develop where if guy was creating a nuisance, the neighbors complained, the complaint went to the courts. The court said, lawyer says, not the lawyer, the judge says, okay, fella, you got to do this. Proactive producers, and obviously with the discussions we're having in this workshop, pathogen concerns may be requiring plans. The devil in the details of nutrient management plan is if it's required by law, that effectively makes it a farm specific law, which means that you have legal dictates on your management practices. And if you're not careful, I've seen where the nutrient management plan would include things that exceeded the requirements of the permit, and those excessive components were included in the permit, so the guy is now legally liable for more than what just the permit itself required. So that's something we need to be concerned about as a potential. And then the other issue you have is most nutrient management plans require documents. And if you keep the documents, do the documents help you or do they hurt you? And to that effect, if you look at the possible scenarios, If you've got a good plan that you can live with, that you implement, and you keep records that document that proper implementation, you've got pretty good legal protection. On the other hand, if you got a bad plan that you can't implement correctly, and you've got documents that show that you've got poor implementation, I don't think you want to be there. If you got a bad plan and you decide, hey, I'm going to falsify my records to indicate proper implementation, that'll come to light at some point in the future, especially if your soil test phosphorus goes through the roof. And again, I don't think you want to be there.
Dr. VanDevender?
Yes.
We have about 5 minutes before we need to move on.
Thank you. I'll rush it on.
Thanks.
Generally, the applicable regulations depend on what type of nutrients are you applying. Is it organic or inorganic? Is it a dry manure or a liquid manure? Where are the nutrients that are land applied, or where the nutrients are land applied? Is it applied inside the nutrient surplus area of the state or outside the nutrient surplus area of the state? And you'll notice that I've got that character there who's figured out, well, when somebody tells you generally, that means there's going to be specific cases that don't quite fit under that generally. And I don't want to go into them in this presentation, but there will be nuances that sometimes the regulators don't know who's responsible. And I've seen that happen quite often. So you just kind of have to work your way through the processes. I mentioned nutrient surplus areas. The state of Arkansas has the northwest corner of the state has a series of watersheds that are split across the state boundaries. Those areas have been determined to be nutrient surplus areas due to concerns with interactions with their neighboring states. The nutrient surplus area pertains to nitrogen and phosphorus applications. Whether it is animal-based or inorganic-based, just nitrogen and phosphorus, regardless of the source. If it's an inorganic nitrogen, it can follow protected use rate tables that are included in the regulations. If it's poultry litter, it has to use a nutrient management plan. And so far, that has been included to anything that is not inorganic is kind of treated like poultry litter by the regulators. The nutrient management plans have to be developed by certified planners. If you apply nutrients to more than 2.5 acres in a year, you have to be a certified applicator. And these regulations are administered by the Arkansas Department of Ag and Natural Resources Division. And Extension is involved in providing the educational components of the certification processes, but the actual certification comes through the Department of Ag. Liquid manure regulations. As of 1992, liquid manure is legally defined as manure that's had water added. It's management. The regulation applies statewide. The plans have to be developed by certified planners. They have to be approved and included in the permit. The land application sites have to be permitted, and you can't apply except on those sites. Annual application reports are required in the Arkansas Department of Energy and Environmental Quality Group, or ADEQ is what they used to be, or the primary agency. On the voluntary side, USDA Natural Resource Conservation Services provides a lot of cost share funding, and a lot of folks will go to them to seek cost share to help put a practice in place. And those practices are voluntary. You don't have to do it. But many or most of the certified planners work out of these offices. The plans are based on the nutrient surplus area regulations, but NRCS has added extra components, as we talked about earlier. And the various competitive funds are available for environmental or protective practices. However, you have to remember that it's not legally required to participate, but if you do participate, there are going to be some legal contractual obligations, and those are administered through the local NRCS offices. If you have other contractual partners, livestock and poultry integrators, many of those are requiring nutrient management plans or strongly encouraging their use. some lending agencies won't lend money unless you get a nutrient management plan. The key concept I'd like to make on this is with the nutrient management planning process, it's an excellent tool. It is a sharp tool. It has very strong benefits, but you want to make sure you're paying attention to what you're doing when you get one developed. With that, I'll shut up. Anybody have any questions? I'll be happy to answer them now. I will be hanging around for the presentations for the rest of the week, and you should be able to go back to the presentation to get my phone numbers and email if you'd like to contact me that way.